because it was raining, so we were wrong. My name is Vicki Vieira. I'm the Vice President of the Historical Society, and it's a pleasure to welcome you here. We used to do this, for a while it was packed like this, and then attendance went down, and we were lucky if we filled 4 rows. And we're back again, and I'm thrilled. And I'm sorry to tell you that every chair the library has is out. So I think there used to be more chairs in that closet. We present a Chronicles lecture once a month on usually the 3rd Thursday of the month from June to October, and I hope you were with us. I hope you had a seat to be with us at the last one, and I'm glad you're here with us tonight. The next Chronicles is August 15th, once again here, and it's Mr. Greg Ketchen is coming. He's the president of the Coast Guard Heritage Museum, and he's going to be talking about shipwrecks along the Cape. You'll want to come on in and see that. I want to let you know that we are being videotaped tonight, and we plan to live stream it on our website. The last lecture is also up and running, so you can catch it on our website also. And last time I did not have this, and I really felt bad. I said, we have so many community sponsors now, I just can't list them all. Well, that's because I didn't have the list. I have the list. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to PBS. The Historical Society wishes to acknowledge our 2019 community partners, without whose generosity we would not be able to be standing here. Central Cape Construction Company, Turnkey Vacation Rentals, Bartlett Tree Experts, Cotuit Fresh Market, Cotuit Oyster Company, E.T. Johnson and Associates, J. Miller Picture Framer and Gallery, Kettle Ho Restaurant and Taverna, Mycock Real Estate and Insurance Agency. Don't leave that Taverna part out. Yeah, I know. Polar Cave Ice Cream Parlor and Sow's Ears Antiques. So for those of you who don't know, Cotuit has a lot of beautiful homes, but especially we have more than any other village of the beautiful mansard roof homes. And tonight, these 2 gentlemen are going to take you through a virtual tour of these homes. So we have with us tonight Phil Odence and Jim Gould. Now, I'm betting you already know who they are. And if you don't know who Jim Gould is, who are you and where have you been? Jim is our historian. I was going to say emeritus, but he's our historian in Forever Us. And he knows everything there is to know about the history of our beautiful village and is always willing to share it with us. Phil grew up here on the Cape in the summers. I would say he's a budding historian himself. He writes a blog, always of great interest, and he's going to be the speaker. Jim, I've been told, is the color coordinator tonight. So welcome, gentlemen, and thank you.
That's right, thank you. Well, I'm overwhelmed by the crowd. Obviously, Jim's reputation precedes me. Come on, that was good. Okay, spontaneous actually. Okay, so I guess I am a budding historian, but I did bring along a real historian to back me up and keep me honest. I also note that there are people in the crowd about whose homes and relatives I'll be speaking, and both Jim and I are quite open to anybody calling us out on mistakes or augmenting any of the material that we're going through. So yeah, Jim's the guy who doesn't need an introduction, and I guess I'll say a little bit about myself, but really in the context of sort of what brought me to the front of the room. I should also say I have spoken here, I think once before, certainly been at a number of events, and coming to the library is always such a great experience for me, having spent so much time, mostly at the other end in my youth. But it's great to be here and wonderful to have such a crowd. So as Vicki said, I was almost born here. I certainly spent my first summer here, and a few summers later, that's me down at the Loop. And and I'll not. I was gonna talk through some of Jim's contributions, and actually, all of these contributions here tie into our story tonight. But I'll not go through that. So yeah, I've been here a long time. Currently known as Larry's son. Used to be known as Marion and Meyer's grandson. And of late, I'm known as one of the two people who bought Nancy Grant's house across the street and fixed it up. So I mention this because it's really one of the beginnings of what brought me here tonight and this talk. And excuse me in advance if this is a little bit Philip-centric, but I found, and I think this is probably the nature of the beast doing historical research in Cotuit, I found a lot of these things not only tied together, but tied back to me and my life in different ways. And so I have, some of these houses have touched my life and vice versa. So I say that's one of the threads, is having bought what the house called Laughing Gull Hill. It really got me interested in the history of Cotuit, of houses, of architecture, and all that. My youth in Cotuit that I've already alluded to also is one of the other threads. And I at some point in the last several decades, I realized I grew up thinking that was a Cape Cod house, that style was Cape Cod. I grew up in a house that is architecturally known as a Cape, happened to be in southern New Jersey where there are many of them. But so for me, this was a Cape Cod house, and I guess the light bulb that went on was, no, that's not really a Cape Cod house. It's really a Cotuit house. Now there are a smattering of mansard roofs throughout the Cape. There's Jim's article there on the Fuller Farm is an example of one nearby in Marston's Mills. But as Vicki said, the real concentration is here. And the last thing that got me interested in this topic is I walk a lot, and Jim's always been a big walker. I don't know if your interest in the architecture of the village came out of that, but I find that after you've walked by a house 40 or 50 times, you start noticing things. So that's the background. So where it all started, and this is where it started for Cotuit and where it started for my research. So where it started for Cotuit was a house called Sand and Wood, and hold that thought, we're going to come back to it. But that's Sand and Wood. That's the first mansard house that was built in Cotuit. My research started because the blog that I wrote. So I do blog. I intend to keep it up, and I'm taking on historical topics. What I blogged about for 2 years was restoring Nancy Grant's house, and we kind of finished to the extent you can in a 200-year-old house. In any case, there were fewer and fewer things to write about. So I started writing about other older houses in town, and I had this idea about mansard roofs would be a good topic. And so I did end up writing a blog about it, and I started Googling, and I hit on this ad. It was a house, it's right at the top of the town dock hill. And it was this ad, and it referred to this house as one of Cotuit's 26 Mansard Ladies. And I thought, well, that's a very nice way to refer to these houses as Mansard Ladies. Not connecting the dots to the article that Jim wrote for the Historical Society called Mansard Ladies. And in fact, I went through my collection of Cotuit Historical Society papers. I Googled to see if I could find anything else. I thought I had in my mind maybe Jim had done something, but I couldn't find it. So I charged ahead on the basis of this article, and in my walking about town with my iPhone camera, set out to find all 26. Well, we'll go through the numbers, and it turns out there really aren't 26 standing today, so it was a bit of a fool's errand. And I finally found out Jim's article, and I went to him, and we compared notes, and it's a little hard to decide exactly what you count and what you don't count. But that's the root of this article. So where it really started was 400 years ago with a guy called Francois Mansard, with a T, who was a French architect. He was born in the late 16th century and was a fairly well-known architect in France through the early 17th century. And he invented this gambrel roof, or at least was one of the architects who refined it. And the idea was really a practical one. It was to take the attic and build it out a bit so you could put rooms up there. So it started very practical, and the first practical little place he made was the Chateau de Maisons, which is it's in a southwestern suburb of Paris called Maisons de Lafitte, I think. And it was a summer home for a guy who was a politician in the mid 1600s, who, as I understand it, married a very wealthy woman and put a lot of her money into building the chateau. His name was René de Longy or something, I think. But mansard roofs really became popular in France during the Second French Empire, which is kind of middle 19th century, and during that time, a guy named Haussmann, it looks like Haussmann in French, I think you say Haussmann, rebuilt Paris, and that's really when the style became embedded, and so such an icon of Paris, and that was kind of 1850, 1860, and Cotuit was not far behind. And in fact, there's mansard roofs in Cotuit, there's mansard roofs elsewhere in the United States, but all of the ones I picture here, which are very famous, you've got the Executive Office Building near the White House that you may have seen on the news occasionally in the last couple of years. You've got City Hall, Philadelphia, is the one with the tall spire and William Penn on top. The Renwick Gallery in D.C., and then the old Boston City Hall, all great examples of mansard roofs. And all of those came after Sandonwood. So things really, Cotuit really was at the forefront of this architectural movement. And so the first one, as I said, was Sandonwood. And this is where, as we get into the stories of each house, this is where Jim bails me out a bit. But it was built by a guy called Colonel, I guess that was from the Civil War, Colonel Augustus Thorndike Perkins. Okay. And he was the grandson of a guy called Thomas Headyside. How do you say his name? Handasset, okay. Perkins. And who was an Indian merchant, and very, very wealthy Boston Brahmin family. And this is really the first summer house that was built in Cotuit. The concept of the summer house here didn't exist. Houses were where you lived when you weren't at sea, for the most part. So they were wealthy. They built it, and maybe you could say some of the connection with Grover Cleveland and some of the politics. So he led the Democratic Party and was involved, I think, in the post office wars. Is that right?
Yeah. The Perkins got into local politics on the Democratic side.
Yeah.
Against the Republican, who's in your house.
Yes. Yeah.
And they had a big fight about the post office because the post office postmaster changed, of course, with new administration.
Right.
The old one went out, and so they sequentially appointed their daughters as, or in the case of Perkins, he appointed his governess as the postmistress. Great fight. Of course, when Cleveland was defeated by a Republican, then it changed again. So they changed. The post office changed several times. Great battle. The biggest political battle in Cotuit. Republicans versus the Democrats.
Yeah. So the guy in my house was Andrew Lovell, and he was succeeded by his daughter Lizzie. And Andrew Lovell grew up in Carol and Adam. Where are they? They're here somewhere in Carol and Adam's house, the red house on Putnam. And then he had actually been born off by Little River in the old house there next to the oyster company. So that was the first one, and 2 years later, that was 1863 during the war. 2 years later, this one was built. So this This house is 884 Main Street. You don't really think of it as Main Street. I've got a star on the location there. It's the point that sticks out between Hooper's Landing and the town dock. And I grew up knowing it as Helen McClellan's house. Helen McClellan was a local real estate agent and investor. And she had, I saw some reference to her rescuing it. I guess it was in bad shape then, as we'll sort of see. It's in very, very bad shape now. And I also knew that it was the house of A. Lawrence Lowell, which I thought was a pretty cool name growing up. He was the president of Harvard and really started the wave of Harvard professors that come in here for the summer. But it was built by his father. He actually inherited it from his
father-in-law. Father-in-law.
So he married a
the
Lowell?
Daughter of
A Lowell
George
married
Gardner,
a Lowell?
yeah.
Okay, so I did.
Cousins.
Cousins. Well, that worked in those days. And George Gardner Lowell was the grandson of Francis Cabot Lowell, who was known to have started the Industrial Revolution. When he put together, he started up a textile mill called the Boston Manufacturing Company on the Charles River in Waltham, and I lived there.
Wow.
Another connection. So yes, Beth and I bought a loft there about 4 years ago, and we live right in one of the buildings that was part of the Boston Manufacturing Company. So I told you I'd make it about Philip when I could. So that they called it the Place, and it's really quite a place. If you don't mind a little casual trespassing like I don't, you can walk up from the beach. There's a staircase up in December and look around, and it's really one of the most remarkable pieces of property in Cotuit. And
It's only part of it. Helen McClellan found it too big,
Yeah.
and moved the kitchen end over so they. But it's not Mansard style,
Right.
so it doesn't count.
It doesn't count. And I think the same family owns both, not Helen McClellan's family, but there is a family which I believe owns both pieces now. Yeah. So just a little more, and this is the one house on which I have two slides. But I think this is really wonderful. So I graduated from Dartmouth College, and in 1985 Dartmouth opened the Hood Museum, an art museum. And Beth and I and the kids moved back and lived in Hanover for about 9 years, starting in 1990. And I'd never been to the Hood. And I remember soon after we moved, I thought, I should check out this art museum, and went in and wandered around. And I went upstairs, and there was that painting called My Family in Cotuit, painted by Edmund Charles Tarbell around circa 1900. And so if I don't know if it's big enough, but you can see Bluff Point, Codman Point, and the island in the background, and the picture below it was, as I said, in December, sneaking up onto the property, and pretty much the same angle. And it's amazing how little has changed. Certainly the trees on the bank are different, but the island and the point look exactly the same. And the last picture is just to give you a sense of the shape of the house now. It's in pretty bad shape. I'd be surprised if it was standing in a decade, and it's unfortunate because so many of these houses have survived, and not only survived but thrived. And as we go through, you'll see many of them have been redone very nicely. With this one being a great example. So 2 years later, this is what's known as the Finney House. So it's again right at the top of the hill, the northeast corner of Oyster Place, coming up to Main Street. And it was built by Irvin Finney. It's the one that was in the ad, as I mentioned. It was built by a fellow called Irvin Finney, who was evidently a house painter. And I don't know if it's fact or speculation, but you thought maybe he had worked on the place, which is about 200 yards away, and got the idea.
And like everybody too, he went to sea at a very young age.
Yep.
And had the fortune, perhaps, never to make captain.
Yeah.
When he was aboard a ship, bringing a load of coal from Philadelphia to Boston, the ship was shipwrecked by a sea captain, a local captain, who lost his life in the surf, and is the Coon family,
Yeah.
which is now the Jackson the
Right.
Jackson house.
Right, James Coon.
So they were both drowned. The captain, the captain, when the ship capsized, was hit by the boom and very badly injured, so he couldn't rescue his son,
Yeah.
very young son. So the two of them died. Finney survived and decided to quit
Yeah.
the sea.
House painting was safer
Before
work.
anymore, which was smart.
Yeah.
So he got it probably painted the house for. But he was also in the cranberry business.
Yeah.
As were a lot.
Well,
of,
and an oysterman.
and an oyster.
And you'll see there, and we'll come back to oysterman. There's a big oysterman thread that runs through. But mansard roofs were very popular with oystermen, a number of them. This one. So now we have a 10-year gap, and one of the things I'll do at the end, I'll show you a little graph of when they were all built. The 90s were really the heyday, but we had several built in the 60s, and then for whatever reason, a 10-year gap. And this one I call the Hoxie House because that's how Jim had designated. But I think we figured out. We know who Hoxie is. He was the local constable.
Yeah.
He had a greenhouse. He had a grocery store and a nursery, and he was a florist. But you think it was actually built by Charles Finney, right?
Yeah.
Who's a cousin of Irvin's. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Finney's can be remembered. You go to the cemetery and you see a slate gravestone with a big iron bar holding it back.
Oh, yeah,
Now we
yeah,
see it
yeah.
broken in half. That was Charles Finney who built the house.
Yeah.
We gather that he was a great pool player.
And there was a pool hall in town.
There was what?
There was a pool hall in town.
Yeah.
Yeah. On I guess about where the Kettle Ho is, right?
No, on the other side of the street.
Okay.
Where?
Okay. So same year was the Hull House. So this was built by Ulysses Hull, another captain. It's located on Main Street, and you can see Cross Street, which comes up from Riley's Beach, and kind of directly across from there, and on the corner of Hull Lane, which is not a coincidence. It happens to have been named after him. He was a retired captain. He turned coal dealer, and also was way into racehorses. And so this is Ulysses. This is a book out of Jesse and Jim's great book on Catuit and Santuit. And this is actually on a racetrack in Catuit, which is out by where Raylan Road was. Is that
Yeah.
right? So the old what became the Santuit Golf Course and ultimately turned into a
He
development.
was one of the best racers on Cape Cod for 3 years running in the 1870s.
Wow.
He won the.
He was the guy, huh?
The races. These were all done in Dennis.
Yeah.
But the practice was out here on their Catuit's own race course.
Yeah. So growing up, I knew this as the Victor Bowden House, so a couple interesting threads on the Bowdens. One is that he was the son of Clara Nickerson Bowden, who was the woman who wrote The Cut of Her Jib about her grandmother. So they discovered, she discovered her grandmother's diary, and her grandmother Faith married Seth Nickerson. Do I have it right? And the diary was about their marriage, and she actually went to sea, and so Clara fictionalized it into a great story. If you haven't read it, you should. The other notable thing about the Victor Bowdens is they are arguably responsible for me. So they lived in Moorestown, New Jersey, 2 houses from my mother's family, and it was during a time when there were polio epidemics in the summer in the mid-Atlantic, and people would head for the mountains or for the sea, and so the Bowdens invited my grandparents on that side to come up, and that was responsible for my mother coming to Catuit and meeting my father. So that's what I mean. I think without the Victor Bowdens, we would not be talking about the mansard roofs today. So this is where the numbers get a little funny. There's the carriage house. So this was a structure with a mansard roof that was attached to the Hull House. the Bowdens split it off and moved it back in 1946, I think. And so is that two Mansard Ladies or one? You know, you call it. But it's a little setback. It's on Hull Lane, and it's just really back into the side from the main Ulysses Hull house. So now we're up to 1879, and Captain Wendell Nickerson. He was a schooner captain. And by the way, there's going to be a lot of Nickersons. Another stat we'll finish with at the end is how many of these houses were Nickerson houses. You might have called and so this is in the high ground. This is on Shell Lane, and you know there's two Shell Lanes. So the North Shell Lane, so the west side just north of the North Shell Lane, so that's part of what had been called the high ground. This was Cotuit Port. That was the high ground, and then Cotuit. Santuit was called Cotuit, and now it's now that's Santuit, and the high ground and Cotuit Port were merged into Cotuit.
That's because they moved up after the two hurricanes. High ground was named the Nickersons,
Yeah.
and the Rogers and the other families that had come from Harwich
Right.
for fishing here. They were down in Brushy
Papaneck,
Marsh.
Brushy Marsh area, yeah.
It took two hurricanes to drive them out. Finally up
They
to
figured-
high ground.
They figured it out.
That's the
finally.
origin of the name high ground.
Yeah. And another thing that some oldsters may remember is Foster Nickerson, who was a disabled guy and had this sort of gas-powered golf cart kind of thing that he would drive around town. You know, pretty old-fashioned looking.
Miss Riley commissioned
Yeah.
Dave Leland, the engineer,
Yeah, to
the
build.
steam engineer who electrified the one night on the 4th of July to make this little Wendell Foster had cerebral palsy.
Oh, is that what it was?
Had
Yeah,
great
yeah.
difficulty speaking.
Yeah.
But Miss Riley, the wonderful benefactress of the flower
Yeah.
flower lady.
Yeah.
We'll talk about her house after.
Yeah, that's great. So, and so the last little piece here is in somewhere around 1977. My Uncle Gates, Larry's brother, bought the house, and there was it's been redone in the last decade or so, and they added on the back end with the mansard roof. None of that existed. So they respected the architecture very nicely. It was a smaller house, and off the back was a shed, and if you went in the shed, there was Foster Nickerson's old cart. Sitting
What do they
in the
call
shed.
that?
I don't know what it's called.
I think. Anyway, he was the
The sulky?
express dealer. If the post office got an express special delivery,
Yeah.
he
He'd
would get
take
in
care
a
of
little
it.
cart and take off.
Yeah.
They took it anywhere in
Well,
Kentucky.
because of course in those days there were no mailboxes, there were no numbers on the houses. Your mail came to your name, Cotuit, and then they advanced the zip codes and things went crazy from there. So this house is kind of across the street from there, a little to the south between Cross and Main or Cross and C Street on Main Street on the east side. And it's another Nickerson house, the Edson Willard Nickerson house. And if you're very nice, Teresa Egan will show you a picture from, we don't know how old it is, but it looks like a very old picture judging from the long skirt on the woman in the picture. And she brought it along, and looks like it's going around now. So
Can I add to this
Sure.
house and the previous were built, we feel were built by the same builders.
Mhm.
Because the angle, it sounds crazy, but the angle of the slopes
Yeah.
on the mansards are not all the same.
Yeah.
But on these two in particular were rehabbed by the same architect and construction, and they were exactly the same.
Wow.
We think that they were both built by the same
No,
contractor.
so it's interesting as I'm trying to unravel the mystery of Laughing Gull Hill. It started as a half cape, and if we're lucky, we'll be up here in a year or so talking about Philip's half Cape research, but that's one of the things I've been going by in comparing the different, what houses that I think started as half capes is what the angles of the roof are. So I think that's a great clue.
As to who the builders were, the first one was built by Charles C. Burks.
We didn't mention him.
Who was an Osterville born, I became a sea captain and ran the coop and was a selectman and state representative and so on.
And lived in the house
he
just
built
north of the
He
coop,
built the
right?
first one. Now, whether he built the place, we don't know.
Right.
I've asked Hannah Cabot about that, and although she has a shingle, she had a shingle.
Yeah, from it.
Shingle from the original house. She didn't know who the architect was. May have been a Boston architect, but it's quite different from Sandonwood.
Yeah.
But several of the other houses were probably built by Burrs.
Yeah.
But he couldn't build all 23.
Yeah, probably not. And many of them do look very, very similar. Although, I think the angles are a very interesting clue. I guess just to finish up on this one, there's a couple things. One, so Victor's brother, Mars Bowden, so Claire's other son, lived in this house when I was young and for many years. And I think I got my first introduction to whiskey sours there. I also remember they had chameleons on it, but I remember sitting out on the screen porch as a very young guy, and it was the first time I saw a chameleon, and of course was intrigued.
Who is there today?
What?
I think Teresa lives there.
Ah,
And she did a very nice job redoing the place.
it's
It
the
looks
second
gorgeous.
one she's done.
Can I
Yep.
She
I
has
think
been
a very first-
great.
Yeah, please. She's going to tell us a little
This is
bit.
the
Yeah.
innovation of the joy and innovation that some of the older members of the community came to. When I first bought the house, I was confused because there was a hose on the porch
Huh.
roof, one of those flat hoses.
Yep.
And I finally said to Rich one day, "What the blazes is this hose for?" And he laughed. He looked at me and said, "You don't know?" And he attached it to the faucet outside and turned it on. And of course, it was clearly obvious right away that the hose was to air condition the porch.
Oh,
Because it
wow.
was one of those that sprayed, it had a hole in it every 2 or 3 inches and it sprayed all over the roof. That was Marston.
Did you keep the hose?
No, I didn't keep the hose. I didn't keep the porch either.
Yeah, well. And then the other thing I'll point out is, and you can see in the picture, the old barn didn't have a mansard roof, and so
It had tails,
it had what?
tails.
Tails? Me-
T-A-L-E-S.
Oh, okay. Yes. Well, understood.
So do you count that as a?
Well, that's the question: is do you count that as a mansard lady? Maybe
Well, it's-
maybe a mansard maiden.
What year was that built?
2006.
Is that our
2006.
our most recent mansard then?
That
No,
could.
no.
What year
The
was
most
that?
recent one is at 15 Putnam.
Oh, really? That was after
That was it.
after this was done.
I
Okay.
rehabbed that, but I didn't rehab it till after I did.
Oh, okay. I was confused. I had thought that had come first. So she said she did 15 Putnam after this. So built that one there. And then there's actually the other one is Ocean View, which we'll look at. Do you know whether the one on Ocean View came after?
I think, would be my guess looking at it,
That it was
think it's
before?
after
After.
the house.
Oh, it was after. It was definitely after the house.
But that was before my.
Before yours. Okay, that's what I was asking. Okay. This one's out on Old Post Road, 939 Old Post Road, so kind of across from the cemetery. It was also built in 1879, and Ezra Hobson was an oysterman. Oh, sorry. So Ezra Hobson, who built it, was an oysterman and worked for a guy called William Childs, who plays a big part in this story as well. But I told you about the lobster connection. I'm sorry, I said lobsterman. I meant an oysterman. And evidently, Childs gave this to his employee, Mr. Hobson.
To his children.
Well, but this one.
His daughter married Hobson.
Okay, so and that explains the wedding gift. Why he gave such a generous wedding gift. And then we'll talk. He
First of five.
He had a few more wedding gifts. I've got 4. You think 5?
Oh, boy.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right.
This is where Louise Harmon, our postmistress, lived.
Right.
Was born there.
Yeah. So you'll note this is not a mansard roof, but there is a mansard roof connected to it. So the Highview Tea Room, which was this is the Pines Hotel on Ocean View, and next door to it on the right was the Highview Tea Room, which was built in 1880 and did have a mansard roof. I couldn't find a picture of it. And it's the first one that we're going to talk about that was torn down. It was actually torn down, I guess after the Pines was torn down in 1959. And I guess the only other historical fact I know, they served ice cream in the tea room, and I believe the other historical fact is that Rita Neal, who many of you know, scooped ice cream at the ice cream place. So she worked in the Highview Tea Room. But this is the first of 4 that we know of that existed but were ultimately taken down. So don't exist anymore.
It was called a cottage, by the way. All of these, including the first one, Perkins' house,
Yeah.
were all called cottages.
Yeah.
It's sort of a Newport thing that came to Katuitt.
Right.
If you look at all the cars, we're opening up the cottage
Right.
today.
It's like some of the camps in the Adirondacks, which don't look like what you think of as a camp. So recall oysterman William Childs and how generous he was with his family. So this one he was responsible for, built, and gave to his daughter Melissa after she married William Crosby, who was a coasting captain. It's on the west side of High Street, and you'll see it's one of 3 that he was responsible for. So the west side of High Street, just a little north of the church on High Street, and it's another one that has a mansard garage or barn that makes it difficult for us to count how many ladies there actually are. And this is another one. This was to the sons, Samuel Childs, who was also an oysterman working with his father, and when he got married, he got a house as well. Continued to work in the business, and today Tom Hadley lives there, and Tom is very, very known for running the launch here for many years. Across the street is one that William Childs had nothing to do with, and this was, oh no, I'm sorry, this one he did have to do with. It's the next one. I keep being in the way. Okay, I've got a cheat sheet here, so you'll have to excuse me some. So I misspoke. This is the 3rd one, and then there's one more that he didn't have anything to do with. So this was he gave to his daughter Sarah, who married a guy called Ezra Gifford. So it's known, therefore, as the Gifford House, and it's almost done. This picture is probably a couple of months old, a little more than that, maybe 3 months old. So I've been walking by, every weekend all year to see the progress, and they've done a really nice job with the renovation. The other historical significance is that this is where Harry and Claire Crocker lived. And so Harry worked for 25 years with his father Milton, who started the coop. And Milton and Harry ran the coop for years. And they raised their family here. He died fairly young, at 68 years old. I can't believe it's now 30 years-ish since he died. And I was just Googling a little to see if I could find something about Harry, and I found a reference to him in an article in the New York Times about Cape Cod potato chips. It was actually, the article was from a couple of years after he died, and evidently the guy who started Cape Cod potato chips didn't know anything about potato chips, bought a machine, was experimenting, and he started bringing bags over to the coop, and Harry said sure, and would carry him in the coop, and people, they were pretty popular, and this was some of what gave potato chip guy the confidence to really go for it. So Harry's got a little piece of Cape Cod potato chips. The other thing I'll mention, because somebody here may know the answer, I always admired the anchor that was in the front yard. They had an anchor. The tines, one was on the ground, the other was about this high, and the shaft of the thing must have been 10 feet long, and it sat there for many years. And I don't know if it got sold, given away, stolen, no clues. Boy, I'd like that anchor. Too bad. Okay, I haven't really been calling the dates out, but we're in the heyday now, where there were some started in 1880, and you see most years during the 1880s, at least one was built. So this is the Baker House, 15 Putnam Avenue. As Teresa mentioned, she redid it, and the original occupants were Luther Baker and his family. And I don't know much more about the Bakers, but one thing I can tell you is how indebted I personally was to Teresa, because I used to often walk by that house on my way to the yacht club, and it drove me crazy to see the weeds growing out of the gutters. It was in such bad shape; it broke my heart every time I walked by. So I was very enthusiastic to see work being done on the house and to see it so beautifully done.
One very interesting point about it, when it was gutted and they had the engineer there, because we extended the kitchen on
Yeah.
the back. They had the engineers there, and the house was absolutely square.
Huh.
And it was at that point, it was easily 100-something years old.
Wow.
It was absolutely
Square,
Thank you.
meaning it hadn't shifted or at all.
Amazing. You would not find that in our house. And it's
right next door to it.
yeah, and it's one of the other ones with a very nice mansard barn. So thanks for that as well. This is the Roland Nickerson house. It was built the next year, 1886. Pretty recently renovated, and somebody may be able to help me with this as well, because the mansard part is, you can see it to the right, and it was added on to further right. So you got a gambrel roof barn, which is not mansard. You got the mansard part. What you don't see is it extends left with a whole nother structure, which I understand was maid's quarters and a laundry for one of the houses on Ocean View. Anybody know? Got any more color on that? Larry, do you know? No, clueless. Okay, but if Brownie Schwartwood was here, he could tell us. But it was so maid's quarters that got put together with the Nickerson house. So another one of the Nickersons in the high ground. And then here's a Gifford, and we were thinking maybe they're brothers, but we're not sure. But this Gifford is another oysterman called Harry Gifford. Harry is spelled unusually Harrie, and you can see it on the house. They've got one of the nice Historical Society plaques. And he had oyster beds in Papaneset. And so I guess made sense for him to live at that end of the village. He was probably the furthest south. I mean, once the Nickersons had abandoned trying to live down there, he was probably the furthest south house, and so closest to his oyster beds. The more recent history is that the house was the home of the Madisons, and Mrs. Madison was Mary Woodman and was one of the originals of the yacht club. So many of you know this, but if you don't, the yacht club was started in 1906 by a group of kids. I think it was 16 maybe or something, and most of them
girls and 3 boys.
Okay, so 15. So it was mostly girls, and Mary Woodman was one of them, and married Madison, and so in this house, this was a house of sailors, and we have a grandson here, Johnny Murray, whose mother Anna Madison was the Commodore of the Yacht Club for the. I guess it was Joe was Commodore for the 25th anniversary, but Anna was one of the early Commodores of the Yacht Club, and anyway, it was all the Madison kids were sailors and spent a lot of time with the yacht club. The other piece of it, I'm looking at my notes, is it's interesting that the house next door, I guess they ran out of room and had a house next door, and this one, Johnny, make sure I get it right, this was the ship and the other one was called the Helm, right? Yeah. Anything else as somebody who grew up there?
One later down back they built for Grandma, and they called that the Anchor.
Oh,
But this was the ship, and I think at some point as the kids got older, the parents moved next door to the Helm.
right,
And of course, on a boat, the captain steers and is at the helm.
yeah, so
Parents
it's kept an eye on things. Okay, and the Anchor, was that the guest house behind the Helm?
Yeah,
Where you spent your honeymoon,
I did.
I think. Because I think I remember putting some smoke bombs under the. Okay, so this is on School Street, and if you saw, I don't know if you saw the ad for this or the article about this in the Patriot, but it has a picture in it that I hadn't seen of this Captain Edwin Fuller house that is essentially across the street from the Kettle Hoe and Taverna, and it was built in 1886, and we think it was built for his wife Emily after he died, because he perished, I believe, at sea.
Must have been a good insurance policy.
I guess somebody or somebody was very nice. So,
Her husband was one of the captains aboard the steamship that went regularly from Boston to Savannah. You didn't go to Florida. Florida had too much yellow fever.
Yeah.
You went to Savannah, and so the ship was loaded with all of these cripples and ancient people like me. And Captain Fuller had the first run, which is the hardest part, from Boston around the Cape, where the greatest danger was, and took it all the way to the Vineyard. When another captain then relieved him, he went to bed, and the new captain ran it aboard the Devil's Ledge.
oh, wow.
The Devil's Ledge is where the south side of Martha's Vineyard,
Wow.
and virtually all of the people perished, including Fuller himself, who was last seen knocking on the doors of the cabins and trying to get these crippled people
my God.
out.
Wow.
He lost his life, but this was built 2 years after his death. So obviously, probably good insurance money.
I
But
guess.
the wonderful thing about it is that in Teresa's picture, there's a picture of Charlie Fuller, who was the town barber.
Yeah.
Kudu had always had a barber, and the Fuller son lived here. The barber shop was across the street where the Kettle Hole is today.
Yeah.
Could I ask you why they had so many disabled persons on the boat?
Well, they were trying to get away from the Boston winters.
Oh, okay.
Not so different from today. Snowbirds, early snowbirds. So this is the Handy house, but it was also, and it's another one that was torn down. It was located on the corner of C Street and Ocean View, the southwest corner. And the picture on the right is looking north on Ocean View, and you can see the Sears house, which is, I think the O'Briens own it today. And you can sort of get a sense for this house on the left.
Actually, it should be called the Aaron Nickerson House. Another, just to confuse things.
Okay.
Aaron Nickerson opened this as a grocery store for the high ground,
Yeah.
and continued. His brother was in the grocery business too, and later was bought by the Handys. But the reason we probably stick with the name of Handy, it became known as the place where you got your pictures done. If you got a Kodak.
Yeah.
Kodak, you took it down to the Handys, and And of course, they made a lot of prints.
Yeah.
So if you see the early postcards of
They say
Katuitt,
hand.
most of them are
Yeah,
done.
that's interesting.
We're sold at the Handy House.
They also sold shoes. So if you needed shoes and you were on Ocean View, you were in good shape.
Shoes and photos.
I think this, yeah. So now we're back to High Street, and we're just one north of Tom Hadley's house, and this is the Coleman house, and if you look at it, and this is, Jim and I have been sort of increasing our learning as we've gone along. It says Eben Smith on the house. I think Eben Smith was the carpenter, but Coleman was Gilbert Coleman, a mason, so it may have been the carpenter built it on spec, and Coleman took it over. He was also an oysterman and part of the Little River cruise. A lot of the oystering then went on, as today, out of Little River Road there, where the Katuitt Oyster Company is. My story with this is that, as I alluded to at the beginning, I was frantically searching for these 26 structures, which there weren't. And I think I was at 23 and stymied. And Christmas Day, I guess day after probably, I was out taking a walk, and I was walking by Loop, and I saw some folks I knew taking a dip. It was a very warm Christmas day, and they were just doing it on a lark, pre the polar plunge for New Year's. And so they came out, and I was talking to them, and I'm trying to find the lady's name. They introduced me to Pam Hamlin, and somehow, who lives here now, somehow the discussion of the article I was working on came up, and she goes, "Well, I live in one of those." And I said, "Really?" And she told me where it was, and I couldn't believe, because I'd walked by it. There was 3 others there. I'd walked by it a million times. But if you look, there's one little piece of mansard roof left on the back, and that's about it. And, the whole front end has been completely redesigned. And so that was, it was the solution to the mystery, and it turned out to be the last one that I hadn't found. At the time, I didn't know it. I just thought I was one closer to 26. But anyway, it turns out that it was the last one. I'd already gotten pictures of all the others. So this is the Gilbert Nickerson house, another oysterman. It's located just south of Piney Road. If you're driving north on Main Street, stop at the stop sign. There it is. Ann Leahy, who's in the back, lives there now. It's been nicely redone. I don't know a lot about Gilbert Nickerson, except he was a Civil War vet. I know that.
Yeah, Sergeant Major.
There you go.
In all of the battles.
Yeah.
He was in the Katuitt Regiment, which was raised. He spent 3 years for the Civil War.
Oh, but not a seagoing Nickerson, as many of them were. So we're getting through the 1880s with another Nickerson, and this one would be Captain Andrew Crosby Nickerson. Sorry. He was one of the Katuitt captains, and like many of them, Jim was saying earlier, many of them went to sea at a young age. And this is an old tradition, even into the British Navy. Midshipmen would be 12 years old, and their captains would take responsibility for teaching them, reading, writing, and arithmetic, as well as how to be an officer. But he actually went aboard a ship as a cook, and then worked his way up through the ranks, as many of them did, and ultimately
Then became an agent in New York, which was then chartering ships.
Huh.
So he was very wealthy.
Business guy.
Took instead of going into painting or oystering, he made it as a businessman in New York.
So I had the wrong house. All right. let me do a little reset. So I misdirected you. So Ann's house we haven't gotten to yet, and this is my specs not
He was
working
also
well.
in the Civil
Yeah.
War.
So I had right guy, right story, wrong house. So this house, I should look this way because I can see it better. So this is a house that's a little further south than I was talking about it. So it's right across from Cross Street, and it's where Dale Edmonds and Barbara Fay live now, and they redid it in the '90s. It was one of the first ones really to get a nice redo, and it's in great shape.
This is the house where the German professor
Oh, that's right.
lived. Professor George Jones, a well-known Germanic scholar, wrote 20 books or so.
Harvard.
On various. No, he
No.
was actually at Southern University. What was it?
Huh. We'll get back to you.
University of Maryland.
Ah, okay. So one same neighborhood, again a little farther north. This one, and this house was built in 1889. It's the Dottridge House, and it was Captain Bennett Dottridge, another Dottridge, and you'll see he's mentioned in a number of the papers from the Historical Society. When I was growing up, there was the McKinnon family lived there, Donald McKinnon family, and it's a pretty big house because they had a pretty big family. And more recently, it was renovated just about 5 years ago by George and Holly Lloyd. And the only way I can tie this in is the Lloyd cousins, George and Holly, are cousins of the Terry Lloyds, and Terry was married to Perky Lloyd, and Perky is short for Perkins, and she goes back to the first Mansard, which was Thorndike Perkins. So there you
Bennett
go.
was one of those unlucky sea captains.
Yep.
He was wrecked 4 times.
Wow.
He'd retire, go into the coal business, and then go.
Give it another go.
The final one, his son, Ollie, whose gravestone you can see in the cemetery. Poor Ollie died. He clinging to his father's shoulders. His father could swim and
Wow.
made it ashore, but Ollie
Oh.
let go. So that retired him permanently.
I'll say too, Jim's mentioned the cemetery a few times. If you haven't gone to the old part of the cemetery and wandered through, it's really quite interesting. You find, most of the people we're talking about, you will find their resting places. So another Finney, part of the Finney family. This is Captain Isaac Finney. This house was built at the end of the heyday, 1889, and it's on Ocean View. It actually, you don't really see it from Ocean View because there's a big hedge, but if you go to Cross Street and look up, this is looking up the drive from Cross Street. And I don't know a ton about him. The house was restored a couple of times, and the first time with Bill and Dee Dee Burgess restored it in the '90s, but I think it's been redone since then. And it's yet another with a nice barn. Happens to be attached. I think it might have been separate and attached later, but it does also happen to be a barn with a mansard roof. And so when it's attached, is that 1.5 mansard ladies? I don't know how you want to count it. So we're coming into the home stretch here. This is the Scudder house. Gustavus Scudder built it in 1890, so now we're into the
Known
next.
as Gus.
Gus, well, yes, known as Gus Scudder. And it's located almost right in the point between Ocean View and Main Street. It's just one down Ocean View from there. And yet another one where they added a barn, and that was done in later years, but prior to Teresa's doing the same with her 2 renovations. So now we're in the center of town, and there have been a bunch of great papers written by the folks for the Historical Society. The Historical Society publishes on the center of town. If you haven't seen them, they're well worth checking out. But the picture on the left is looking down School Street, and the building sticking out behind it is more or less where the Kettle Hoe is today. So this is right on the corner, and so it's part of the Memorial Park. and it was a department store called Sears, which has nothing to do with Sears Roebuck, just happens to be the same name. So Benjamin F. Sears, and he expanded. So this is the original store, and then to the right you can see he expanded it, added another floor, substantially increased the size of the place, but maintained the mansard lines when he did so.
Yeah, there are 3 incarnations. The first edition was one story on the north side, and then he put a second story on top of that.
Which is the mansard.
Yeah.
So it wasn't mansard originally. Is it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. So now we jump ahead a couple of years to 1893, and we're out on School Street, way out of town. Not that far out of town actually. Before you get to Highland Avenue on the north side of School Street, and this was built by Captain J. Winthrop Sturgis, 1893, as it says. And when Jim wrote the article, the most recent Mansard Lady to have been constructed, Jim counted it as one, was the barn, and it was built by Jimmy Gardner, who I think lives there today. This one's a really interesting one, Hillside House. So the story is, and many of you may know most of the story, the first hotel, really, at least the first resort-style hotel on the Cape, was the Santuit House. And it started, there was a guy called Coleman, Braddock Coleman, who just took boarders in. And mostly people would stay there on their way, if they were going to Nantucket or to New Bedford. They would stop overnight. They'd take the stage down and from Barnstable, and they'd stay there overnight and then get on a schooner in the morning. And so
His wife did all the work though, making the beds, cooking the food.
So she must have been thrilled as he decided to expand the business. But he did, and did it successfully. So the picture on the right, you can see, well, I'll use a shadow. So that was the original big expansion, and then he built that on. And then this was a house here that was smaller. It was actually a cape, very much looks like mine, and they built that up. And then in the trees here is Hillside House, which was the last piece they built. And so this really sat. It's kind of the corner of Main Street and Old Shore, but really a little back down towards Hooper. So really sitting on the hill above the gully essentially that is Old Shore Road. And so Santuit House started with probably with him betting people, letting people stay in his house in the 1830s. He ended up selling to a family called Webb. They're actually the ones who expanded it during that period, and it was going gangbusters into the 20th century, but there was a big fire and it all burned down in 1925. Hillside House did not burn down, so I'm not sure exactly why it was taken down, but maybe it was just impractical for anything but a hotel, and nobody was gonna run it as a hotel. That's my speculation. So it was not. I think 1935 they ended up taking it down. So it stood for 40 years, and for most of that time was used as a hotel. Must have been a very, very cool. The whole setup must have been very cool. I'm fascinated by Santuit House overall. So this is the last of the what I'll call the golden era. So it was built in 1899. It's located near the post office on the south side of School Street, and it was the Coleman House, Captain Bennett Coleman, and I think he's the brother of Braddock Coleman, who was the guy who started the guest house that we were just talking about. And as I understand it, it was. It got an award in the mid-90s for historic renovation based on the colors. That the colors are really cool, and they've maintained those colors all along the way. Okay, so into the home stretch here. This is the last one, And this would get an asterisk, I guess, because it's kind of a mansard roof, but built in a very different era. There is built by a Boston designer called Clark in 1964, and it sits on Main Street. Yeah, so there you can see just south of Coolidge on the east side of Main Street, and sort of above Conrad Geiser's operation, if you know where that is. You know, very, very different, very high ceilings, very, you know, much more modern, perhaps more French, but that would be the last of the ladies. So we'll just finish up with a few stats, and on the right you can see a picture that Jim put together by hand, and it's on the back of the paper that the Historical Society publishes, and you'll see it's reasonably accurate, but as we've learned stuff along the way, it's, you know, if he was redoing it today, some of the numbers would change and we'd add and subtract. So there were 28 built, and that doesn't count the barns or the hull house. And so 4 were taken down, so I would say counting by that, there's 24, and I found them all. There's 14 on Main, there's 4 on Ocean View, there's 4 on High, there's 2 on Old Post, there's 3 on School Street, and 1 on Putnam, which I keep wanting to call Maple, because if you don't know, that was, for many years, it was Maple Street. 5 by Nickerson's, although from some of our discussion, we're probably in the 5 to 7 range, maybe the 6 to 7 range. And as I said, 24 standing today. And then the last little picture there is, you know, gives you a sense of that heyday. So a few built in the 1860s, it started to ramp in the 70s, and the 1880s were big with 13 of them built. So just about every year through the 1880s, one was built, and it didn't tail off that much. A half a dozen of them were built in the 90s. And then I could have 1964 way out here at the end and a few barns. But that's it. Thank you. I'd be happy to take any questions and probably pass them to Jim. We take comments as well.